The crack of a gunshot echoed across the dusty streets of Redemption Creek, sending a flock of startled birds into the azure Wyoming sky of 1873. Yale. Preston's expression never changed as the man across from him crumpled to his knees, clutching his shoulder and howling in pain. Yale holstered his Colt revolver with mechanical precision, his ice-blue eyes revealing nothing as he approached the wounded outlaw. "Next time you decide to threaten a shopkeeper in my town," Yale said, his voice as dry and unforgiving as the surrounding badlands, "remember I aim to wound only once." The gathered townspeople watched in silence as Yale dragged the criminal toward the sheriff's office. Not a single smile crossed his face, not a hint of satisfaction or remorse. Nothing ever seemed to touch the man they called Stoneheart Preston. The whispers followed him down the boardwalk. They always did. "Cold as winter in the Rockies, that one. Heard he killed 20 men before coming to Redemption. They say he ain't got no heart at all." Yale heard them, as he always did, but their words bounced off him like raindrops on leather. The rumors weren't entirely wrong. He hadn't felt much of anything since the war ended and his family's ranch burned to the ground. 8 years of emptiness had carved him into something hard and unyielding, a man respected and feared, but never loved. Sheriff Morgan took the wounded man off Yale's hands with a grateful nod. "That's the third one this month, Preston. Don't know what we'd do without you around here." Yale didn't respond. He simply tipped his hat and turned to leave. "You ever think about taking the badge?" Morgan called after him. "Town could use a man like you permanent-like." "I work better alone," Yale replied without turning back. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as Yale made his way toward the livery stable. His Palomino stallion, Justice, needed exercise, and Yale needed space from the suffocating gratitude of the townspeople. Their thanks meant nothing to him. He didn't protect them out of kindness. He protected them because it was what he knew how to do, like breathing or shooting straight. Just as he reached the stable, the afternoon stagecoach rumbled into town, wheels kicking up clouds of dust as it came to a halt before the Redemption Creek Hotel. Yale wouldn't have paid it any mine travelers came and went regularly, except for the commotion that erupted moments after the coach door opened. "Thief! Stop him!" A raggedy man burst from beside the stage, clutching a woman's reticule as he sprinted down the street. Before Yale could even reach for his gun, a blur of movement caught his eye. One of the stage passengers, a woman in a dusty blue traveling dress, had taken off after the thief at a dead run. In all his years, Yale had never seen a lady move like that. She hitched up her skirts with one hand, revealing mud-splattered boots beneath the fabric, and ran with the determination of a cavalry charge. Before the thief had made it 20 yards, she launched herself at his legs in a flying tackle that would have impressed the roughest cowhand. The pair went down in a cloud of dust. When it cleared, the woman was sitting squarely on the would-be thief's back, one knee pressed between his shoulder blades, calmly retrieving her reticule with her free hand. "I believe this belongs to me," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent street. She glanced up, catching Yale's stare, and for the first time in years, something unexpected happened inside his chest, a little hitch, like justice stumbling over uneven ground. Her eyes were the color of whiskey held up to sunlight, and despite the dirt now smudging her cheek, her face had a determined beauty that stopped Yale cold. Sheriff Morgan jogged up, wheezing slightly, to take the thief into custody. "Madam, that was quite impressive, but mighty dangerous." The woman stood, brushing dust from her skirts with dignity. "Perhaps in your town, Sheriff, but where I come from, we don't let thieves simply run off with our belongings." Her accent had the refined touch of the East, but underneath it ran something stronger, more resilient. "And where might that be, madam?" Morgan asked, hauling the thief to his feet. "Philadelphia, most recently." She straightened her hat, which had remarkably stayed attached during the commotion. "Penelope Everett. I've come to take over my uncle's medical practice." A collective murmur swept through the growing crowd. Yale felt his eyebrows rise slightly, the only expression he'd shown all day. Doc Willis had been Redemption Creek's physician for 30 years before his passing 3 months back. The town had been without medical care since, relying on the midwife and a traveling doctor who came through every few weeks. "You're a lady doctor?" someone asked from the crowd, disbelief evident. Penelope Everett's chin lifted. "I'm a physician who happens to be a woman, yes?" Yale found himself studying her more carefully. She stood straight-backed despite the dust of travel clinging to her clothes. Her hands, now adjusting the pins in her honey-brown hair, looked capable and steady. Something about her radiated competence and a quiet strength that seemed strangely familiar to him, though he was certain they'd never met. "Well, Miss Everett," Sheriff Morgan said, "welcome to Redemption Creek. Might have been nice if Doc Willis had mentioned you were coming." "Mrs. Everett," she corrected, "and I imagine he would have, had his heart given him time to write. I only received word of his passing 2 weeks ago." Yale noticed the gold band on her finger then, and something inexplicable, almost like disappointment, flickered through him. Ridiculous. He had no business feeling anything about this woman's marital status. "I'll need assistance getting my medical supplies to my uncle's house," Mrs. Everett continued, turning toward the stagecoach where the driver was unloading trunks and cases. "I can help with that," Yale heard himself say before he'd consciously decided to speak. Every head turned toward him, surprise evident on every face. Yale Preston voluntarily offering assistance to a stranger? The world must be ending. Mrs. Everett's gaze met his, evaluating. "Thank you, Mr. Preston, Yale Preston." Something flickered across her face recognition, perhaps, but she quickly masked it. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Preston, but some of my medical equipment is quite delicate. Perhaps I won't break anything," he said, his voice flat. She studied him a moment longer, then nodded. "Very well." Yale approached the stagecoach and began carefully handling the trunks marked with a caduceus symbol. He was aware of whispers around him, the townspeople's shocked reactions to his uncharacteristic behavior. He ignored them as he always did, focusing instead on the task at hand. "I've got a wagon," he said, nodding toward the livery. "We can load everything there." Mrs. Everett nodded, then turned to thank the stagecoach driver before following Yale. They worked in efficient silence, loading her trunks and medical equipment. Yale noticed she didn't hesitate to lift the heavier items herself, though he stepped in when she reached for a particularly large crate. "I've got it," he said, hoisting it into the wagon bed. "Thank you." She wiped her brow with a handkerchief. "Most men I encounter either insist on doing everything for me or nothing at all. It's refreshing to find a middle ground." Yale didn't respond. He wasn't used to casual conversation, especially with women. As they finished loading the wagon, Mrs. Everett climbed up to the seat without waiting for his assistance. Yale took the reins, clicking to the horses, and they set off toward the other end of town where Doc Willis's combined home and office stood. "You knew my uncle?" she asked after a minute of silence. Yale kept his eyes on the road. Everyone knew Doc Willis. "That's not what I asked, Mr. Preston." Her directness surprised him. Most people in town had learned not to press him for conversation. "He patched me up a few times. Gunshot wounds?" Yale glanced at her. Her expression revealed nothing but professional curiosity. "Some. Knife once. Broken ribs. You seem to live dangerously. Just life out here." They fell into silence again until they reached the doctor's house. The white clapboard building looked forlorn with its shuttered windows and overgrown garden. Mrs. Everett gazed at it with an unreadable expression. "Been empty since he passed," Yale said, setting the brake on the wagon. "Town's been keeping an eye on it, though. Should be in decent shape inside." She nodded, then reached into her reticule and pulled out a key. "I suppose I should see what I'm working with before we unload everything." Yale followed her to the door, watching as she unlocked it and stepped inside. The interior was dim with the shutters closed, but clean. Someone, probably the preacher's wife, had kept it dusted in the intervening months. Mrs. Everett moved through the front room, which served as a waiting area, and into the examination room beyond. Her fingers trailed over the examination table, the cabinets of medicines and instruments. There was something almost reverent in her movements. "I spent summers here as a girl," she said softly. "Uncle Edward taught me my first stitches on a chicken he'd just butchered for dinner. I was 7. The image of a small girl carefully sewing up a dead chicken made something unfamiliar tug at the corner of Yale's mouth. Not quite a smile, but perhaps its distant cousin. She turned back to him, composure restored. "Well, let's get everything inside. I want to be settled before nightfall." They worked steadily for the next hour, bringing in her trunks and medical equipment. Yale found himself impressed by her organizational efficiency. Each crate was clearly labeled, and she directed him exactly where to place each one. "The last one goes in the bedroom upstairs," she said, pointing to a trunk with her initials painted on the side. "It's personal items." Yale nodded and carried the trunk up the narrow staircase. The bedroom was simple but comfortable, with a large bed covered in a faded quilt and a dresser with a mirror. He set the trunk at the foot of the bed and was turning to leave when he noticed a photograph in a silver frame on the nightstand, the only personal touch in the room. Curious despite himself, he stepped closer. The photograph showed a much younger Penelope in a wedding dress, standing beside a man in an army uniform. They were both smiling, though even in the sepia-toned image, something about the man's eyes seemed distant. "My husband, Captain James Everett." Yale turned to find Mrs. Everett standing in the doorway, watching him. He felt a rare flicker of embarrassment at being caught snooping. "Forgive me," he said stiffly. "Nothing to forgive. It's natural to be curious." She moved into the room and picked up the frame, looking at it with a complicated expression. "James died at Gettysburg, 10 years ago now." Something cold and familiar settled in Yale's chest. "I was there at Gettysburg." Her eyes met his, searching. "Which side?" "Union, 8th Pennsylvania Cavalry." She nodded slowly. "James was with the 69th Pennsylvania Infantry." An awkward silence fell between them, the kind that always happened when the war came up. Too many memories, too much loss on both sides. "I should go," Yale said finally. "Let you get settled." "Thank you for your help, Mr. Preston." She set the photograph back on the nightstand. "I imagine I'll be seeing you again, professionally speaking, given your tendency toward injuries." There it was again, that strange tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I'll try to disappoint you, Mrs. Everett." As Yale left the doctor's house and climbed back onto his wagon, he felt oddly unsettled. Something about Penelope Everett had gotten under his skin in a way he couldn't quite define. It wasn't just that she was beautiful. Plenty of beautiful women had passed through Redemption Creek without affecting him in the slightest. No, it was something in her direct gaze, the competent way she carried herself, the flash of grief he'd recognized when she spoke of her husband. It was the first time in years he'd felt a connection to another person, however slight, and that, more than anything, disturbed him. Yale flicked the reins, turning the wagon toward home, trying to push thoughts of the new doctor from his mind. He had his routines, his solitary life at his small ranch outside town, his occasional work helping the sheriff keep order. That was enough. It had to be enough. He had no heart left to offer anyone. Everyone in town knew that, even if Penelope Everett's whiskey-colored eyes had, for just a moment, made him wish otherwise. The next morning dawned clear and crisp, with the promise of heat to come. Yale rose before the sun, as was his habit, and went about his morning chores. The routine was comforting, feeding the horses, checking the fences, cleaning his guns. The physical labor kept his mind occupied, prevented it from wandering to places better left untouched. By mid-morning, he had ridden into town to check in with Sheriff Morgan, as he did most days. The sheriff was at his desk, nursing a cup of coffee and looking over wanted posters. "Mornin', Preston," Morgan greeted him. "Heard about you helping the new doctor yesterday. Half the town's talking about it." Yale leaned against the door frame, expression neutral. "Not much to talk about." "For anyone else, maybe. For you?" Morgan chuckled. "You haven't voluntarily spoken more than 3 words to a newcomer since you arrived here, let alone helped one with their luggage." Yale shrugged. "Town needs a doctor." Mm-hmm. Morgan's knowing look made Yale straighten up, ready to leave. "Speaking of the doc, she's already seeing patients this morning. Got her shingle hung up and everything. Martha Jenkins took her youngest in for that cough he's had." Yale nodded, uninterested in town gossip. "Anything I should know about?" Morgan handed him a wanted poster. "Keep an eye out for this one. Jasper Holloway robbed the bank over in Copper Springs last week. Killed a teller." Yale studied the crude drawing of a bearded man with a scar across his cheek. "I'll watch for him." "Oh, and Preston," Morgan called as Yale turned to leave. "The Founders' Day dance is Saturday. Committee's asking all able-bodied men to help set up the town square tomorrow." Yale gave a non-committal grunt and left the office. The annual Founders' Day celebration was Redemption Creek's biggest event, a day of contests, food, and ending with a dance under the stars. Yale had successfully avoided participating in the previous 2 since he'd arrived in town. This year would be no different. He spent the rest of the morning at the general store, purchasing supplies and ignoring the curious glances sent his way. Yale was used to being the subject of town gossip and speculation. His reputation had been established early, the dangerous, taciturn cowboy who kept to himself except when trouble arose. He'd never cared what they thought before. Why should he start now? As he loaded his supplies into his saddlebags, a commotion from down the street caught his attention. A crowd had gathered outside the doctor's office, raised voices carried on the still air. Frowning, Yale secured his purchases and walked toward the disturbance. He found Mrs. Everett standing on her porch, arms crossed, facing down Horace Blackwell, one of the wealthiest ranchers in the territory, and a man known for his rigid opinions. "I will not have my wife treated by a woman doctor," Blackwell was saying loudly. "It ain't proper and it ain't natural. Doc Willis wouldn't have wanted this." "With all due respect, Mr. Blackwell," Penelope replied, her voice calm but firm, "my uncle specifically left his practice to me in his will. I am fully qualified, having graduated from the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania with highest honors. Your wife's condition requires prompt treatment, and I am the only physician within 50 miles. "Then I'll take her 50 miles, Blackwell shouted. "No woman's going to be poking around my Margaret's insides." Yale could see Mrs. Blackwell sitting in a wagon nearby, pale and obviously in pain, a young maid beside her looking frightened. "Your wife has symptoms of appendicitis," Penelope continued, her professional demeanor never slipping. "If that's the case, she likely won't survive a 50-mile journey to the next doctor. She needs surgery immediately." A murmur went through the crowd. Appendicitis was often a death sentence in these parts. "Surgery?" Blackwell sputtered. "Absolutely not. You're not cutting into my wife." "Then you're condemning her to death," Penelope said bluntly. Yale had heard enough. He pushed through the crowd to stand at the bottom of the porch steps. "Blackwell," he said, his quiet voice somehow carrying more authority than the rancher's shouts, "let the doctor do her job." Blackwell turned, his face reddening further when he saw Yale. "Stay out of this, Preston. This is between me and this woman pretending to be a doctor." "Margaret needs help," Yale said simply. "Pride's a poor reason for a man to lose his wife." The words hung in the air. Everyone knew Blackwell doted on his young wife, despite his blustering manner. The rancher's expression faltered, uncertainty creeping in. From the wagon, Margaret Blackwell let out a soft cry of pain. The sound seemed to break something in her husband. His shoulders slumped. "You're sure it's her appendix?" he asked Penelope, his voice suddenly smaller. "I can't be certain without examining her more thoroughly, But the symptoms strongly suggest it, she answered. The sooner we act, the better her chances. Blackwell looked torn for another moment, then nodded curtly. Fine. But I'm staying with her the whole time. During the examination, yes, Penelope said firmly. During surgery, no. I'll need complete concentration and a sterile environment. Mrs. Jenkins has agreed to assist me as nurse. Yale watched as Blackwell helped his wife from the wagon and up the steps. Margaret's face was gray with pain, but she managed a grateful smile at Penelope. As they passed into the doctor's office, Penelope's eyes met Yale's briefly. She gave him a small nod of thanks before following her patients inside. The crowd began to disperse, though several people lingered, discussing this dramatic turn of events. Yale overheard snippets of conversation as he turned to leave. Never thought I'd see Blackwell back down to anyone. Hope Margaret pulls through. A lady doctor doing surgery? I don't know. Yale found himself strangely invested in the outcome. He'd never had much use for Horace Blackwell, who represented everything Yale disliked about wealthy cattlemen, but Margaret was by all accounts a kind woman. And something about the way Penelope had stood her ground, calm and competent in the face of Blackwell's blustering, had impressed him. Instead of heading directly home, Yale found himself taking a seat on the bench outside the gunsmith's shop across from the doctor's office. He told himself he was just resting before the ride back to his ranch, but the truth was, he wanted to know what happened. The hours ticked by slowly. Yale whittled a piece of wood with his pocket knife, creating small shavings that blew away in the occasional breeze. Around noon, Sheriff Morgan wandered over, eyebrows raised at finding Yale still in town. "Keeping watch?" Morgan asked, nodding toward the doctor's office. Yale grunted non-committally. "Heard about what happened with Blackwell." Morgan sat down beside him, stretching out his legs. "Didn't expect you to get involved." "Didn't expect to," Yale admitted. Morgan studied him for a moment. "That new doc's something else, ain't she? Standing up to Blackwell like that." Yale made no reply, focusing on his whittling. "Pretty too," Morgan continued, a sly note entering his voice. "Widow, I hear." Yale's knife slipped, nearly cutting his thumb. He shot Morgan an irritated look. The sheriff held up his hands. "Just making conversation." They sat in silence for a while longer before Morgan stood. "Well, I've got rounds to make. Let me know how Margaret fares, if you're still here when it's over." Yale nodded, and the sheriff ambled off, looking entirely too pleased with himself. Another hour passed. Yale had whittled the piece of wood down to nothing and was considering leaving when the door to the doctor's office finally opened. Horace Blackwell emerged, looking exhausted and oddly humbled. He stood on the porch for a moment, removed his hat, and wiped his brow. Yale stood, unexpectedly tense as he waited for some indication of the outcome. Blackwell noticed him and, after a moment's hesitation, walked across the street. When he reached Yale, he extended his hand, a gesture Yale couldn't recall the rancher ever making toward him before. "Preston," Blackwell said gruffly, "I owe you thanks." Yale shook the man's hand briefly. "Margaret? She's going to make it." Blackwell's voice cracked slightly. "That doctor, Mrs. Everett, she found the appendix just about to burst. Said if we'd waited even a few more hours." He trailed off, clearing his throat. "Margaret's resting now. Doctor says she'll need to stay there for a few days, but she should recover fully." Relief washed through Yale, surprising him with its intensity. "Good news." Blackwell nodded, putting his hat back on. "I was wrong about her, the doctor, I mean. Never seen hands so steady, not even on Doc Willis in his prime. And she talked me through everything she was doing. Calm as you please." He shook his head in wonder. "Reckon we're lucky to have her in Redemption Creek." "Reckon so," Yale agreed quietly. Blackwell headed toward the saloon, likely in need of a strong drink after his ordeal. Yale remained where he was, eyes on the doctor's office door. A few minutes later, it opened again, and Penelope emerged. She looked tired, her hair coming loose from its pins, her sleeves rolled up to the elbows. She spotted Yale immediately and walked toward him, a question in her eyes. "Heard the good news," he said as she approached. "Congratulations." A smile transformed her face despite the obvious fatigue. "Thank you, and thank you for intervening earlier. Mr. Blackwell might not have allowed the surgery without your influence." Yale shrugged uncomfortably. He just needed a reminder about what was important. "Still, I appreciate it." She tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "You've been waiting here all this time?" "Had nothing pressing to do," he said, which wasn't entirely true. There were always chores waiting at his ranch. Penelope studied him, and Yale had the unsettling feeling she could see right through his casual dismissal. "Well, I'm grateful for the support. It's not always easy being the new person in town, especially when you're different." The words resonated with Yale more than he cared to admit. He'd always been different too, first as a too serious child, then as a young soldier who'd seen too much, and now as the man the town both relied on and kept at arm's length. "You've made quite an impression," he said. "Saved a life your first full day here." "I was just doing my job." She glanced back at her office. "Mrs. Jenkins is sitting with Margaret now. I should probably eat something before checking on my patient again." Yale found himself speaking before he'd thought it through. "I was about to get something at the cafe. You're welcome to join me." As soon as the words left his mouth, he felt a surge of regret. What was he doing, inviting her to dine with him? He never socialized with anyone in town. Surprise flickered across Penelope's face, followed by a warm smile that did strange things to Yale's normally steady pulse. "That would be lovely, Mr. Preston. Thank you." And so, to the barely concealed astonishment of everyone at Millie's Cafe, Yale Preston found himself sharing a meal with Redemption Creek's new doctor. The whispers that followed them to their table were impossible to ignore, but Penelope seemed unbothered. "I imagine this is quite the spectacle for the town gossips," she said dryly, as they settled at a corner table. "Not used to seeing me with company," Yale admitted. "So I've gathered. The women at church yesterday were quite forthcoming about Redemption Creek's mysterious protector." Her eyes held a hint of amusement. "According to Mrs. Miller, you're either a reformed outlaw, a secret government agent, or possibly not human at all." Yale raised an eyebrow. "Not human?" "Something about your lack of normal human emotions. Her words, not mine." Penelope's expression grew more serious. "They say you have no heart, Mr. Preston." The directness of her statement caught him off guard. Most people tiptoed around him, afraid to provoke his legendary stoicism. But Penelope Everett looked him straight in the eye, no fear or hesitation. "They're not entirely wrong," he said finally. Millie herself came to take their order, her eyes wide with curiosity. After they'd ordered stew and coffee, Penelope returned to their conversation as if there had been no interruption. "I don't believe that," she said. "A heartless man wouldn't have stood up for a woman he barely knows against one of the most powerful men in the territory. Nor would he wait hours to hear about the outcome of a surgery." Yale shifted uncomfortably. "Don't mistake practicality for sentiment, Mrs. Everett. Town needs a doctor, and Blackwell's a fool who needed to be reminded of it." "I see." She studied him over the rim of her water glass. "And do you make a habit of correcting all the fools in Redemption Creek, or am I special?" There was a teasing quality to her voice that Yale found both foreign and oddly appealing. He wasn't used to being teased. People either feared him or treated him with cautious respect. "Don't have time to correct them all," he said, and was surprised to find his mouth quirking slightly at the corner, the closest thing to a smile he had managed in years. Penelope noticed it too, her eyes brightening. "Well, I'm honored to have warranted the exception." Their food arrived, saving Yale from having to respond. They ate in companionable silence for a while, which suited him fine. He'd never been one for unnecessary conversation. What surprised him was that Penelope seemed comfortable with the quiet, too. not filling it with nervous chatter as most people did around him. "May I ask you something, Mr. Preston?" she said eventually. Yale nodded, finishing a bite of stew. "Why did you really help me yesterday? And today with Mr. Blackwell?" Her head tilted slightly as she regarded him. "The truth, please." Yale considered deflecting again, but found he didn't want to. Something about Penelope Everett made him want to be honest, even if he didn't fully understand his own motivations. "You reminded me of someone," he said finally. "Your wife?" she guessed. Yale shook his head. "Never married. You reminded me of myself before the war." Her eyebrows rose slightly. "How so?" Yale struggled to put it into words. "The way you chased down that thief, didn't hesitate, didn't worry about what was proper. Just did what needed doing." He looked down at his plate. "I used to be like that, direct, certain. And now? Now I just do what needs doing, but without the certainty it matters." The words hung between them, more than Yale had spoken to anyone in years. He felt exposed, vulnerable in a way he hadn't allowed himself to be since burying his family. Penelope's expression softened. "Thank you for your honesty, Mr. Preston." "Yale," he said suddenly. "My name's Yale." Her smile warmed something long cold inside him. "And I'm Penelope. I think we're well past formalities, don't you?" For the remainder of their meal, they spoke of safer topics. The town, her medical training, his small ranch. Yale found himself surprisingly engaged in the conversation. Penelope was intelligent and observant, with a dry wit that occasionally caught him off guard. By the time they finished eating, he realized with some shock that he'd enjoyed himself. As they left the cafe, Penelope paused on the boardwalk. "I should get back to check on Margaret." She looked up at him, the afternoon sunlight catching the gold flecks in her eyes. "Thank you for lunch, Yale. It was unexpectedly pleasant." "It was," he agreed, finding he meant it. "Perhaps we could do it again sometime?" There was a hint of uncertainty in her voice, as if she wasn't sure how he would respond to the suggestion of continuing their acquaintance. Yale felt a peculiar sensation in his chest, something like anticipation. "I'd like that." Her smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "Good. I'll see you around town. Then." As Yale watched her walk back toward her office, he was struck by the realization that for the first time in 8 years, he was looking forward to tomorrow. The news of Margaret Blackwell's successful surgery spread through Redemption Creek like wildfire, transforming Penelope from suspicious newcomer to respected physician overnight. Even more shocking to the townspeople was Yale Preston's apparent connection to the new doctor. In the days that followed, Yale found himself making excuses to ride into town more often than usual. Sometimes he'd stop by Penelope's office with fresh vegetables from his garden or game he'd hunted, claiming she needed to keep up her strength while caring for patients. Other times he'd simply appear at lunchtime and they'd share a meal at the cafe. To the fascination of the entire town, Yale Preston, the man they'd called Stoneheart for years, was showing definite signs of thawing. 4 days after Margaret's surgery, Yale rode into town to find an unusual level of activity around the town square. Men were erecting a temporary wooden dance floor, while women hung paper lanterns and decorations from ropes strung between buildings. The Founders' Day celebration was fast approaching. Yale had intended to visit Penelope, but as he passed the square, Sheriff Morgan hailed him from where he was helping position the bandstand. "Preston, perfect timing. We need another strong back here." Yale hesitated, ready to refuse as he always did. But before he could, a familiar voice spoke from behind him. "Good morning, Yale. Are you volunteering to help with the preparations?" He turned to find Penelope watching him with an amused expression. She looked particularly lovely today, her hair arranged differently, her blue dress bringing out the warmth in her eyes. "I was just passing through," he said. "Oh." Was that disappointment in her voice? "Well, it looks like they could use the help." Yale looked from her to the struggling men attempting to hoist the bandstand into position. Sheriff Morgan was watching him expectantly, along with several other townsmen. In previous years, Yale would have simply tipped his hat and continued on his way. But something had changed. "I suppose I could lend a hand," he said reluctantly. Penelope's smile was worth the discomfort of breaking his usual pattern. "Wonderful. I've been helping the ladies with the decorations, but I need to check on Margaret now. Perhaps I'll see you later." Yale nodded, and she touched his arm briefly before walking away. The spot where her fingers had rested seemed to burn through his shirt sleeve, a sensation both foreign and not entirely unwelcome. For the next few hours, Yale worked alongside the other men, positioning the bandstand, laying out the dance floor, and setting up tables for the feast that would accompany the celebration. To his surprise, he found the work oddly satisfying. The other men were cautious around him at first, but as the morning wore on, the shared labor broke down some of the barriers that had long existed between Yale and the townsfolk. "Never thought I'd see the day," Sheriff Morgan said quietly as they took a break, drinking water from a barrel provided by the saloon owner. "Yale Preston, helping with Founders Day." Yale shrugged, uncomfortable with the attention. "Needed doing." Morgan's knowing smile made Yale frown. "Nothing to do with our new doctor, I suppose." "Don't know what you're talking about," Yale replied stiffly. Morgan laughed. "Course not. Just like you haven't been in town every day this week, when before you'd only come in every few days." Yale said nothing, but his silence was apparently confirmation enough for Morgan. "She's good for you," the sheriff said, his teasing tone giving way to sincerity. "Whole towns notice the difference." Before Yale could formulate a response, a commotion at the end of the street caught their attention. A rider was approaching at a gallop, pushing his horse hard. As he drew closer, Yale recognized young Teddy Wilson, whose family ranched about 10 miles outside town. "Sheriff!" Teddy shouted as he reined in his lathered horse. "Trouble out at Willow Creek. Outlaws." Morgan straightened immediately. All business. "How many?" "4 men," Teddy gasped out of breath. "Showed up at our place demanding food and supplies. Pa gave them what they wanted, but they shot our dog when it barked at them. Said they'd be back if Pa told anyone." The boy's face was pale with fear. "Ma sent me to get help as soon as they were gone." "Did you recognize any of them?" Yale asked, stepping forward. Teddy nodded. "One had a big scar on his face. Matches that poster in your office, Sheriff." Morgan and Yale exchanged a look. Jasper Holloway, the bank robber and murderer from Copper Springs. "I'll get my deputies," Morgan said grimly. "Preston." "I'll ride with you," Yale finished, already heading toward the livery where Justice was stabled. Word spread quickly, and by the time Yale had saddled his horse and gathered his weapons, a small posse had formed in front of the sheriff's office. Morgan had deputized 3 reliable men, all armed and ready to ride. As Yale approached, he was surprised to see Penelope emerging from her office across the street, medical bag in hand. She walked directly to the group, expression determined. "I'm coming with you," she announced. Sheriff Morgan shook his head immediately. "No, madam. Too dangerous." "If there have been shots fired, there may be injuries," she countered. "I'm not suggesting I join the fight, Sheriff, but I should be nearby to tend to any wounded." "Mrs. Everett," Morgan began. "She's right," Yale interrupted, earning surprised looks from everyone. "Better to have her with us than to lose time riding back for her if someone's hurt." Morgan looked like he wanted to argue, but finally nodded. "Fine. But you stay back with Teddy once we get close to the Wilson place. First sign of trouble, you both ride hard for town." Penelope nodded, already moving toward the livery. "I'll get my horse." Yale followed her, catching her arm gently before she entered the stable. "Penelope, this isn't a good idea." She turned to face him, chin lifting stubbornly. "I'm going, Yale. As a doctor, it's my duty to be where I might be needed." "These men are killers," he said quietly. "They won't hesitate to shoot a woman." Something flickered in her eyes, not fear, but a deep sadness. "I've seen what killers can do, Yale. My husband didn't die at Gettysburg in battle. He was treating wounded soldiers when Confederate raiders attacked the field hospital. They shot the doctors first." Her voice was steady despite the pain in her eyes. "I was there, assisting. I hid under a wounded soldier's cot and watched my husband die." Yale stared at her, seeing her in a new light. This woman, who had experienced such horror, still ran toward danger when others might be in need. "I'm not asking permission," Penelope continued softly. "I'm simply informing you of my intentions." Yale realized his hand was still on her arm. He released her, nodding slowly. "Then I'll keep you safe." Her expression softened. "I know you will." Within minutes, the posse was riding hard toward the Wilson ranch, Penelope keeping pace on a sturdy bay mare. Yale found himself constantly checking her position, an unfamiliar protective instinct making it difficult to focus on anything else. They reached a ridge overlooking the Wilson property after about an hour's ride. Sheriff Morgan signaled for them to dismount and approach on foot, leaving young Teddy and Penelope with the horses. "Stay here," Yale told Penelope firmly. "If you hear gunfire, take the boy and ride for town." "Be careful," she replied, eyes fixed on his. "I've grown rather accustomed to your company, Mr. Preston." Something warm unfurled in Yale's chest at her words. "I'll be back," he promised. The four outlaws were still at the Wilson ranch, apparently in no hurry to leave. Through his field glasses, Yale could see them lounging on the porch, drinking what was likely Mr. Wilson's private whiskey stock. The family was nowhere in sight, hopefully secured safely inside. "We'll approach from different directions," Morgan said quietly. "Preston, circle around to the back. Johnson and Davis, take the east side. Miller and I will come in from the front. Wait for my signal." Yale nodded and began making his way around the property, staying low in the tall grass. Years of tracking and hunting made him virtually silent as he moved. When he reached the rear of the house, he positioned himself behind the woodshed, gun drawn. For several long minutes, nothing happened. Then, a shrill whistle cut through the air Morgan's signal. Yale moved immediately, stepping out from his cover with his Colt leveled at the back door. "Holloway," Morgan's voice boomed from the front. "This is Sheriff Morgan from Redemption Creek. You and your men are surrounded. Throw down your weapons!" Chaos erupted instantly. Yale heard shouts, then gunfire from the front of the house. The back door burst open, and two outlaws spilled out, guns already drawn. They spotted Yale immediately, and both fired in his direction. Yale dove to the side, feeling the burn of a bullet grazing his arm. He rolled behind a rain barrel, returning fire. His first shot caught one outlaw in the leg, dropping him with a howl of pain. The second man kept firing, splintering the wood of the barrel inches from Yale's head. More gunshots sounded from the front of the house. Yale heard Morgan shouting orders, the crash of breaking glass. Taking advantage of a pause in the shooting, he leaned out and fired twice in rapid succession. The second outlaw crumpled, clutching his shoulder. Yale approached cautiously, kicking their guns away before securing them with rope from the clothesline. His arm was bleeding freely now, the bullet grazed deeper than he'd initially thought. "Preston," Morgan's voice called. "You all right back there?" "Got two of them," Yale shouted back, pressing his bandana against his wounded arm. "Both alive." "We've got the other two," Morgan replied. "All clear." Yale secured his prisoners to a porch post before heading around to the front of the house. Morgan and his deputies had Holloway and the fourth outlaw face down on the ground, hands bound behind them. Mr. Wilson and his family were emerging from the house, shaken but unharmed. "Anyone hurt?" Yale asked. Morgan nodded grimly toward Deputy Miller, who was sitting on the porch steps, pale-faced, a crimson stain spreading across his thigh. "Caught a bullet early in the exchange." "Penelope," Yale said, turning toward the ridge where they'd left her. "Already sent Davis to fetch her," Morgan assured him. "You're bleeding too, Preston." Yale glanced at his arm dismissively. It's nothing. Minutes later, Penelope arrived, medical bag in hand, expression all business. She went straight to Miller, examining his wound with quick, efficient movements. Clean through the muscle, she pronounced after a thorough check. You're lucky no major vessels or bone damage. I'll clean and bandage it here, but you'll need proper stitching back in town. Miller nodded gratefully, gritting his teeth as she began treating the wound. When she'd finished with him, Penelope turned her attention to the wounded outlaws, treating them with the same professional care despite their status as criminals. Only when everyone else had been seen to did she approach Yale, who had been watching her work with quiet admiration. Your turn, she said, gesturing to his bloodied sleeve. It can wait, he replied. It most certainly cannot. Her tone brooked no argument. Sit down, please. Yale found himself obeying, settling onto a nearby stump as Penelope carefully cut away the sleeve of his shirt to reveal the wound. This is more than a graze, she said, frowning as she cleaned the injury. The bullet carved a good furrow. You'll need stitches. Do what you need to, Yale said, watching her face as she worked. Her brow furrowed in concentration, her touch gentle yet confident. He hardly felt the pain, distracted by her proximity, the scent of lavender that clung to her skin beneath the medicinal smells. You're staring, she murmured without looking up from her work. You're worth staring at, he replied honestly. Her hands faltered for just a moment, a flush rising to her cheeks. Hold still, this will sting. Yale didn't flinch as she cleaned the wound with antiseptic, nor when the needle pierced his skin repeatedly as she stitched the gash closed. Her work was quick and precise, and soon she was wrapping a clean bandage around his arm. There, she said, securing the bandage. Keep it clean and dry. I'll check the stitches in a few days. Their eyes met, and something passed between them, something unspoken but profound. For a moment, Yale felt as though he could see straight through to her soul and she to his. The spell was broken by Sheriff Morgan approaching. We need to get these prisoners back to town. Wilson's lending us his wagon for Miller and the wounded outlaws. Yale nodded, rising to his feet. I'll help. No, you will not, Penelope said firmly. You've lost blood and just received stitches. You'll ride quietly back to town, and then you'll rest. Morgan raised his eyebrows, clearly amused by Penelope's authoritative tone and Yale's lack of argument. Doctor's orders, Preston. We can manage. The journey back to Redemption Creek was slower than their ride out had been. Yale found himself riding beside Penelope, who insisted on checking his bandage periodically. Despite his usual preference for silence, he found himself asking her about her experiences during the war, about her decision to become a doctor. It wasn't really a decision, not after the war, she explained. It was a necessity. I'd already been assisting James at the field hospital, and after he died, well, there were still men who needed care. I stayed on, learning more from the remaining surgeons. When it ended, I knew I couldn't go back to being just a society wife in Philadelphia. So you went to medical school, Yale said. She nodded. It wasn't easy. Many of the professors resented having women in their classes. Some refused to teach certain subjects to us, claiming they were too delicate for female sensibilities. A wry smile curved her lips, as if we hadn't already seen worse on the battlefield. But you persevered. I did. Her expression grew distant. James always said I was stubborn to a fault. He used to joke that when I set my mind on something, not even the Confederate Army could stop me. He sounds like a good man, Yale said quietly. He was. Penelope met his gaze steadily. He would have liked you, I think. Yale wasn't sure how to respond to that, so he remained silent. They rode the rest of the way side by side, a comfortable quiet between them. By the time they reached Redemption Creek, darkness had fallen. News of the posse's success had preceded them, and a crowd gathered in the street to watch as the prisoners were escorted to the jail. Deputy Miller was taken directly to Penelope's office, where she would finish treating his wound properly. You should come too, she told Yale as they dismounted in front of the livery. I want to check your stitches in proper light. Tomorrow, he said, suddenly feeling the day's exertion catching up to him. I should get home. Concern furrowed her brow. You shouldn't ride all the way out to your ranch tonight. You've lost blood and it's dark. I've ridden in worse condition, he assured her. That doesn't mean you should. She hesitated, then added, Stay in town tonight. There's a spare bedroom in my house, my uncle's old room. As your doctor, I'd feel better having you nearby in case of complications. Yale knew he should refuse. It wasn't proper for a single woman to host a man in her home, regardless of the circumstances. But the thought of the long, dark ride to his empty ranch held little appeal, and the prospect of being near Penelope was increasingly difficult to resist. If you're sure, he said finally. Her relieved smile was answer enough. Let me just check on Deputy Miller, and then we can go home. Home. Such a simple word, yet it stirred something long dormant within Yale's chest. He couldn't remember the last time anywhere had truly felt like home. An hour later, after Penelope had treated Miller's wound and left him in the care of his wife, they walked the short distance to her house. The streets were quiet now, most of the town having retired for the night. Are you hungry? Penelope asked as she lit lamps in the front room. I could make some sandwiches. Don't trouble yourself, Yale said, feeling suddenly awkward in the domestic setting. I'm fine, she gave him a knowing look. When did you last eat? And don't lie to your doctor. Breakfast, he admitted. That's what I thought. She moved confidently through the kitchen, assembling bread, cold ham, and cheese. Sit down, Yale. You look about ready to collapse. He obeyed, watching as she prepared a simple meal for them both. There was something hypnotic about her movements, efficient yet graceful, each action performed with the same careful attention she gave her medical work. You're staring again, she said without looking up. Can't seem to help it, he replied honestly. This time, she did look up, her eyes meeting his across the kitchen. Something shifted in the air between them, a tension that had been building since the day they met, now almost palpable. Penelope set the plates on the table and took the seat across from him. You should eat, she said softly. They ate in silence, but it wasn't the comfortable quiet of their earlier ride. This silence buzzed with unspoken words, with possibilities neither of them seemed ready to voice. After they'd finished, Penelope showed him to the spare bedroom, a simply furnished room that still held traces of Doc Willis's presence. A medical text lay open on the bedside table, a pair of reading glasses beside it. I haven't had the heart to pack up his things yet, she explained, a note of sadness in her voice. He wrote to me regularly, you know, always encouraging me in my studies, defending my choice to pursue medicine when everyone else thought it inappropriate. He was proud of you, Yale said, mentioned you often. Surprise flickered across her face. He did? Yale nodded. When he patched me up after that knife fight last year, he talked about his brilliant niece who would make a far better doctor than he ever was. Tears welled in Penelope's eyes. I didn't know he felt that way. He did, Yale assured her. Said you had healing hands and a fighter's spirit. Said that was a rare combination. A tear slipped down her cheek, and without thinking, Yale reached out to brush it away with his thumb. His hand lingered, cupping her face gently. Thank you for telling me that, she whispered. They stood frozen in that moment, so close that Yale could feel the warmth of her breath. It would be so easy to lean down, to close the distance between them. But something held him back, the memory of her husband, perhaps, or the fear of what it might mean to truly let someone pass the walls he'd built around himself. Penelope stepped back first, her composure returning. You should rest. There are fresh towels on the dresser if you want to wash up. I'll be across the hall if you need anything. Thank you, Yale said, his voice rougher than usual. For everything. She smiled, a touch of sadness in her eyes. Good night, Yale. Good night, Penelope. After she left, closing the door softly behind her, Yale sat heavily on the edge of the bed. His arm throbbed dully beneath its bandage, but it wasn't pain that kept him awake long into the night. It was the realization that, for the first time since the war, since the fire that had taken his family, he was beginning to feel something again, something that terrified and exhilarated him in equal measure, and he had no idea what to do about it. Morning brought clarity, as it often did. Yale woke to the smell of coffee and bacon and the sound of Penelope moving about the kitchen. For a moment, he remained still, absorbing the unfamiliar comfort of waking in a home rather than his sparse ranch house. His arm felt better, though still tender when he moved it. He washed quickly using the basin provided, then made his way to the kitchen, where Penelope was just setting plates on the table. "Good morning," she greeted him, looking fresh and lovely in a simple blue dress. "How's the arm?" "Better," he said, taking a seat at her gesture. "Thank you for the hospitality." It was no trouble. She poured coffee for them both. "I'm glad you stayed. I would have worried about you riding home in the dark." They ate breakfast companionably, discussing the events of the previous day. Penelope mentioned she would need to check on Deputy Miller and Margaret Blackwell this morning. "And you should stop by later so I can change that bandage," she added. Yale nodded, though he was already considering returning to his ranch and staying there for a few days. The growing feelings for Penelope were unsettling him, pushing him toward vulnerability he wasn't sure he was ready to embrace. As if sensing his thoughts, she said, "You'll be at the Founders' Day celebration tomorrow, won't you? After helping with the preparations, it would be a shame to miss the actual event." Yale hesitated. "I don't usually attend town gatherings." "I know," she said with a small smile. "The whole town knows. But perhaps it's time for a change?" Before he could formulate a response, a knock came at the front door. Penelope rose to answer it, returning moments later with Sheriff Morgan. "Morning, Preston," Morgan said, looking unsurprised to find Yale at Penelope's breakfast table. "Just wanted to let you both know we've identified all 4 of those outlaws now. They're the same gang that hit the bank in Copper Springs. There's reward money coming once we get them to the county seat." "Good news," Yale said. "There's more," Morgan continued, accepting the cup of coffee Penelope offered him. "Turns out they were planning to rob our bank tomorrow during the Founders' Day celebration when everyone would be distracted." Penelope gasped softly. How terrible that would have been. Morgan nodded grimly. "Found the plans in Holloway's saddlebag. They'd been watching the town for days, figuring out routines." He looked directly at Yale. "Judge Henderson wants me to thank you personally for your help yesterday. Said to tell you the town owes you a debt again." Yale shrugged uncomfortably. "Just did what needed doing." "Well, the celebration is still on for tomorrow," Morgan said, finishing his coffee. "And the committee insists both of you be guests of honor for the doctor's surgical skills and Preston's shooting." "Oh, that's not necessary," Penelope began. "Judge's orders?" Morgan interrupted with a grin. "And what the judge wants in Redemption Creek, the judge gets. So I'll see you both there." He set his cup down and headed for the door, then paused to look back at Yale. "Oh, and Preston. Judge specifically mentioned he hopes to see you at the dance portion. Said it's high time you joined the community properly." After Morgan left, an awkward silence fell between Yale and Penelope. The prospect of being a guest of honor was exactly the sort of attention Yale had always avoided. "You don't have to go if it makes you uncomfortable," Penelope said finally. "I could make your excuses. Say your wound is bothering you." Yale considered the offer. It would be easy to retreat back to his ranch, back to the solitude he'd cultivated for years. But as he looked at Penelope, her kind eyes, her gentle smile, he found himself unwilling to disappoint her. "I'll go," he said, surprising himself. Her face brightened. "Really? On one condition," he added. "What's that?" "Save a dance for me." The words came out before he could stop them. Penelope's smile was like sunshine breaking through clouds. "I was hoping you'd ask." Yale left shortly afterward, needing to check on his ranch after being away overnight. As he rode Justice through the crisp morning air, he found himself considering his situation with a clarity that had been missing the night before. He was falling in love with Penelope Everett. The realization should have terrified him, should have sent him galloping in the opposite direction from Redemption Creek. For years he had carefully avoided all emotional attachments, convinced that his heart had died along with his family. But something about Penelope had awakened feelings he'd thought long-buried: admiration for her competence and courage, respect for her dedication to healing, and a deepening affection that grew stronger with each encounter. The question now was what to do about it. Penelope was a widow, but she'd clearly loved her husband deeply. And Yale himself was damaged goods, a man who had spent years deliberately keeping everyone at arm's length. What could he possibly offer a woman like her? These thoughts occupied him throughout the day as he tended to his horses, repaired a section of fence, and harvested vegetables from his small garden. By evening, he had come to no conclusions, but he knew one thing for certain. He would attend the Founders' Day celebration tomorrow, and he would dance with Penelope Everett. Whatever happened after that, he would face it head on. The next morning dawned bright and clear, perfect weather for Redemption Creek's biggest annual celebration. Yale spent more time than usual on his appearance, bathing thoroughly and carefully trimming his beard. He put on his best shirt, a deep blue one he rarely wore, and his newest pair of black trousers. After a moment's consideration, he even polished his boots. Looking at his reflection in the small mirror above his washstand, Yale hardly recognized himself. Gone was the perpetual scowl, the hard set of his jaw. Instead, there was a quiet anticipation in his eyes that hadn't been there in years. The town was already bustling when Yale rode in around noon. Main Street had been transformed, with colorful bunting decorating the buildings and tables laden with food lining the boardwalks. Children ran about playing games, adults gathered in conversational groups, and the band was setting up on the platform he had helped build. Yale stabled Justice at the livery, then made his way through the crowd. People nodded to him as he passed, some calling out greetings with a warmth that was unfamiliar. Word of his role in capturing the outlaws had spread, apparently elevating his status from feared outsider to local hero. He spotted Penelope almost immediately. She was at a table near the doctor's office, offering free health consultations to anyone interested. Even at a festive occasion, she was still focused on caring for others. The sight made something warm unfurl in Yale's chest. She was wearing a dress he hadn't seen before, a rich burgundy that complemented her honey-brown hair, which was arranged in an elegant style with soft curls framing her face. She looked up as if sensing his gaze, and her smile when she spotted him sent his heart racing in a way no gunfight ever had. Before he could approach her, Judge Henderson intercepted him, pumping his hand enthusiastically. "Preston, just the man I wanted to see. Sheriff Morgan told me about your exemplary service yesterday. Redemption Creek is fortunate to have a man of your caliber watching over it." Yale shifted uncomfortably at the praise. "Just doing what needed doing, Judge." "Always modest," Henderson said with a knowing smile. "Well, we'll be recognizing both you and our remarkable new doctor during the official ceremony at 3 o'clock. I trust you'll be there?" "Yes, sir," Yale replied, having no real choice in the matter. "Excellent. And I understand you'll be joining us for the dance as well?" The judge's eyes twinkled. "Mrs. Henderson will be delighted. She's been saying for years that what this town needs is for its resident hero to participate more fully in community life." Yale managed a non-committal noise that the judge seemed to take as agreement. "Well, I'll let you enjoy the festivities. The barbecue is particularly good this year. Millie outdid herself." As the judge moved on to greet others, Yale continued toward Penelope, who was just finishing with a patient. When she saw him approaching, she excused herself and met him halfway. "You came," she said, her voice warm with approval. "Said I would," he replied simply. "And you look—" She paused, her eyes taking in his polished appearance. Very handsome, Yale. He felt his face warm slightly at the compliment. You look beautiful, he said, the words coming more easily than he'd expected. A becoming blush colored her cheeks. Thank you. Are you hungry? I was just about to take a break and get something to eat. They made their way to the food tables together, filling plates with barbecued beef, beans, and cornbread. As they found seats on a bench near the bandstand, Yale was acutely aware of the glances and whispers following them. Penelope seemed unbothered by the attention, chatting easily about the patients she'd seen that morning and how well Margaret Blackwell was recovering. Horace Blackwell actually thanked me again this morning, she said with a hint of wonder in her voice. Said he'd be forever in my debt for saving Margaret. Coming from him, that's quite something. You earned his respect, Yale said. Not an easy thing to do. I could say the same about you. She glanced at him sidelong. You're something of a mystery to this town, you know. Not much to know, he replied with a shrug. I disagree. Her voice softened. I think there's a great deal worth knowing about Yale Preston. Before he could respond, Sheriff Morgan approached, looking harried. Doc got a situation over by the pie judging contest. Billy Morris fell out of a tree and might have broken his arm. Could you come take a look? Penelope was on her feet immediately, all business. Of course. Yale, would you mind? Go, he said. I'll wait for the ceremony. She touched his arm briefly, a gesture becoming familiar between them, then hurried off with Morgan. Yale finished his meal slowly, watching the town celebrate around him. It was strange to be in the midst of such festivities after years of deliberate isolation, but not unpleasant. The official ceremony took place on the bandstand as scheduled. Judge Henderson gave a long-winded speech about the founding of Redemption Creek 25 years earlier, then moved on to recognize various citizens for their contributions to the town over the past year. Finally, he called Yale and Penelope to the stage. Redemption Creek has been blessed this year, Henderson announced to the gathered crowd. Blessed with the arrival of a skilled physician who has already saved lives among us, and blessed with the continued protection of a man whose courage knows no bounds. Please join me in expressing our gratitude to Mrs. Penelope Everett and Mr. Yale Preston. The applause was enthusiastic, with several people calling out their thanks. Yale stood stiffly, uncomfortable with the attention, while Penelope graciously acknowledged the crowd. When they were finally allowed to step down, Yale felt a profound relief. Not one for public recognition, are you? Penelope asked as they moved away from the bandstand. Prefer to go unnoticed, he admitted. I've noticed that about you. She smiled up at him. It's rather refreshing, actually. Most men who do brave things want everyone to know about them. The remainder of the afternoon passed pleasantly enough. Yale found himself drawn into conversations with townspeople who had previously given him a wide berth. Many wanted to hear firsthand about the capture of the Holloway gang, while others simply seemed curious about the man behind the fearsome reputation. Throughout it all, Penelope remained nearby, her presence a steadying influence. Whenever the social interactions became too much, Yale would glance her way, and somehow she always seemed to know, subtly intervening to give him a moment's respite. As the sun began to set, lanterns were lit around the town square, casting a warm glow over the proceedings. Tables were cleared away to make room for dancing, and the band began tuning their instruments. Couples started to gather near the wooden dance floor, anticipation evident in their faces. Yale felt a familiar tension returning to his shoulders. It had been years since he had danced with anyone, not since before the war, at his sister's wedding. You look like a man contemplating a firing squad, Penelope said, appearing at his elbow. He glanced down at her, struck anew by her beauty in the lantern light. It's been a long time since I danced. It's like riding a horse, she replied with a smile. You never really forget how. The band struck up a lively tune, and several couples moved onto the floor. Yale watched them for a moment, then turned to Penelope with a determined expression. May I have this dance, Mrs. Everett? Her eyes softened at the formal request. You may, Mr. Preston. Taking her hand, Yale led her onto the dance floor. Other couples made space for them, watching with undisguised curiosity. Yale positioned his hands properly, one at Penelope's waist, the other holding hers, and began to move. The first few steps were awkward, his body remembering the patterns but executing them stiffly. But as they continued, something shifted. The music seemed to flow through him, and Penelope moved with such natural grace that he found it easy to follow her lead while appearing to lead himself. You're a fine dancer, Yale, she said as they turned around the floor. Another hidden talent. My mother insisted all her children learn, he replied, the memory rising unexpectedly without its usual accompanying pain. Said it was the mark of a gentleman. She was right. Penelope's hand was warm in his, her eyes bright with pleasure. I'm glad you asked me to dance. So am I. As the evening progressed, Yale found himself dancing several more times with Penelope, as well as with Mrs. Henderson and a few other respectable matrons who boldly requested his partnership. Between dances, he and Penelope talked, sometimes with others, sometimes just between themselves. It was during one such private conversation, as they stood at the edge of the gathering sipping punch, that Penelope asked the question Yale had been dreading. Will you tell me what happened to your family, Yale? I've heard rumors, but I'd rather know the truth from you. Yale stiffened, his first instinct to deflect or walk away, but something made him stay, made him consider answering honestly. It's not a happy story, he warned. Few of the important ones are, she replied quietly. Yale took a deep breath. After the war, I came back to Wyoming to find my family's ranch still intact, unlike many others. My parents, my sister and her husband, my younger brother, they'd all survived. We thought we were the lucky ones. He paused, the memories pressing in. We weren't. Penelope waited patiently as he gathered his thoughts. About a year after I returned, a gang of outlaws came through, former soldiers like me, but ones who couldn't adjust to peace. They wanted horses, supplies. My father tried to reason with them. Yale's voice grew flat, emotionless. They shot him first, then my brother-in-law when he went for his gun. Oh, Yale, Penelope whispered, her hand finding his arm. I was in town when it happened, picking up supplies. The words came faster now, tumbling out after years of silence. By the time I got back, they'd taken what they wanted and set fire to the house. My mother, my sister, my brother, all inside. You couldn't have known, she said softly. You couldn't have stopped it. I tracked them, Yale continued as if she hadn't spoken. For months I followed their trail across 3 territories, found them one by one, made sure they would never hurt another family. There was no need to elaborate. Penelope's expression told him she understood exactly what he meant. And afterward? She asked. Afterward, I realized I couldn't go back to who I was before, couldn't feel things the way I used to. It was like something essential had burned away inside me. He met her gaze directly. So I wandered, took jobs that needed a man who wasn't afraid to die. Eventually ended up here. Penelope was silent for a long moment, absorbing his story. Then, to Yale's surprise, she reached up and placed her palm against his cheek, her touch infinitely gentle. Your heart didn't die, Yale, she said with quiet certainty. It just went into hiding to protect itself. Something broke open inside him at her words, a dam he'd built years ago, now crumbling under the weight of her understanding. Yale closed his eyes briefly, leaning almost imperceptibly into her touch. When he opened them again, Penelope was looking at him with such tenderness that it stole his breath. Would you walk me home? She asked softly. It's been a long day. Yale nodded, unable to speak past the emotion clogging his throat. They made their farewells to various townspeople, enduring knowing smiles and significant glances with as much dignity as possible. The night was clear and cool as they walked the short distance to Penelope's house, the sounds of the continuing celebration fading behind them. They didn't speak, but Yale felt a new awareness between them, as if his confession had removed a barrier neither had fully acknowledged. At her door, Penelope turned to face him. "Thank you for telling me about your family, Yale. I know it wasn't easy. Easier than I expected," he admitted. "With you." She smiled softly. "I understand loss. Perhaps that's why we found it so easy to talk to each other." Perhaps. Yale hesitated, then asked the question that had been on his mind for days. "Penelope, what are you looking for here in Redemption Creek?" "Initially, a fresh start, a place to practice medicine where I was needed." She looked up at him, moonlight silvering her features. "Now? I'm not entirely sure. Things have become complicated." "Because of me," he said, not a question. "Yes." Her honesty was refreshing. "I didn't expect to meet someone like you here. Didn't expect to feel—" She trailed off, seeming unsure how to continue. "I know," Yale said quietly. "I didn't either." They stood in silence for a moment, the unspoken attraction between them nearly palpable in the night air. "I should go in," Penelope said finally, though she made no move to do so. "You should," Yale agreed, equally stationary. Another beat of silence, and then, almost simultaneously, they moved toward each other. Yale's hands found her waist as Penelope's arms wound around his neck, and their lips met in a kiss that started gentle but quickly deepened with years of pent-up longing, his for connection, hers for understanding. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing harder than a simple kiss should have warranted. Penelope's eyes were wide and luminous in the moonlight, her lips slightly parted in wonder. "That was," she began. "Unexpected," Yale finished. A small laugh escaped her. "I was going to say wonderful, but unexpected works too." Yale smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes and transformed his face. "Wonderful is better." Penelope touched his cheek again, her expression growing serious. "I don't take this lightly, Yale. It's been a long time since James, and I never thought I'd feel this way again." "I understand," he said. "We can take this as slow as you need." "Thank you." She rose on tiptoe and pressed another quick kiss to his lips. "Good night, Yale." "Good night, Penelope." He waited until she was safely inside before turning away, his steps lighter than they had been in years as he headed toward the livery to collect justice. The night air seemed fresher, the stars brighter, the world somehow more vibrant than it had been just hours before. For the first time in 8 years, Yale Preston was allowing himself to hope for a future that included more than just survival. The weeks following the Founders' Day celebration brought changes to both Yale and Redemption Creek. Where once he had avoided town except when necessary, now he found reasons to visit almost daily. Where before the townspeople had given him a wide berth, now they greeted him warmly, including him in conversations and community matters. Most significantly, his relationship with Penelope deepened with each passing day. They took things slowly, as promised, sharing meals, talking for hours, occasionally stealing kisses when alone. Yale found himself opening up about his family, telling Penelope stories of his childhood, his time in the war, even his darkest moments during the hunt for his family's killers. In return, she shared her own past, her privileged upbringing in Philadelphia, her whirlwind courtship with James, her struggles to be taken seriously as a physician. One evening in late summer, they sat on the porch swing at Penelope's house, watching fireflies dance in the growing dusk. Yale had just finished telling her about his plans to expand his small ranch, adding more cattle and possibly hiring help. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice careful, "that the house needs work if it's going to be more than just a place for one man to sleep." Penelope glanced at him, her expression curious. "What sort of work?" "It needs a proper parlor. Maybe a study that could serve as a home office for a physician who might want to see patients there occasionally." He kept his tone casual, though his heart was racing. And definitely a bigger kitchen. Understanding dawned in her eyes. Yale Preston, are you asking me something? He turned to face her fully, taking her hands in his. I'm asking if you might consider a future that includes me, and my ranch, and maybe... He hesitated, then pressed on. Maybe someday, children. Tears welled in Penelope's eyes, but her smile was radiant. I would consider that a very appealing future, Yale. I love you, Penelope, he said, the words coming easily after weeks of feeling them build inside him. I never thought I'd love anyone again, but you changed that. You made me remember how to feel. I love you too, she whispered, squeezing his hands. And for the record, I think you'd make a wonderful father someday. Yale pulled her into his arms, holding her close as the last light faded from the sky. For so many years he'd existed in a gray half-life, convinced that everything worth living for had been burned away in that fire. Now, with Penelope's head resting against his chest, he felt truly alive again. They were married that autumn in a simple ceremony performed by Judge Henderson. The entire town turned out for the event, filling the small church to capacity. Sheriff Morgan stood as Yale's best man, while Margaret Blackwell, now fully recovered, served as Penelope's matron of honor. As Yale spoke his vows, looking into Penelope's radiant face, he was struck by how far he had come from the bitter, closed-off man who had ridden into Redemption Creek 3 years earlier. The townspeople had been right about him. Then he had been a man without a heart, or at least a man whose heart had gone into deep hiding. But they had been wrong about one thing. His heart hadn't been lost forever. It had simply been waiting for the right person to revive it. After the ceremony, as the newlyweds made their way through town toward the hotel where a reception was being held, Yale overheard Mrs. Miller speaking to another woman. "Never thought I'd see the day," she said, watching Yale and Penelope with a smile. "Remember how we all used to say Preston had no heart at all?" "Well," her companion replied, "I guess it just took the right woman to make it beat again." Yale exchanged a glance with Penelope, who had clearly overheard as well. Her eyes danced with amusement and love. "They're not entirely wrong," he murmured, pulling her close as they walked. "I know," she replied, resting her head against his shoulder, "but I rather like the idea that I'm the only one who gets to hear that heart beating now." 5 years later, Yale stood on the porch of their expanded ranch house, watching as Penelope showed their 4-year-old daughter, Elizabeth, how to listen to a patient's heartbeat with her small toy stethoscope. The patient was Elizabeth's 2-year-old brother, James, who was squirming impatiently on his mother's lap. "Be still, Jamie," Elizabeth said with all the authority of a practiced physician. "I need to hear your heart." "Heart beating," James replied, patting his chest with pudgy hands. Yale smiled, watching his children with a pride that still sometimes overwhelmed him. After so many years believing he would never have a family again, he now had not only a loving wife, but 2 beautiful children who filled his days with joy and occasional exasperation. The rancha had prospered under his careful management, growing to become one of the most successful in the territory. Penelope maintained her medical practice in town, though she had taken on an assistant, a young male doctor fresh from medical school who had been nervous about working for a female physician until he saw her perform surgery. Now he followed her around like an eager puppy, soaking up her knowledge and experience. Yale still helped Sheriff Morgan when needed, but those occasions had grown rarer as Redemption Creek had become more settled. The town had grown considerably, with a new school, a proper bank building, and even a small theater for traveling shows. Life was good, better than Yale had ever dared to hope during those dark years after losing his first family. As he watched, Penelope glanced up and caught him staring. The smile she gave him still had the power to make his heart race, even after 5 years of marriage. "Daddy," Elizabeth called, noticing him on the porch. "Come listen to Jamie's heart. It's very loud and strong." "Just like his father's," Penelope added softly, as Yale joined them on the grass. He knelt beside his family, taking the toy stethoscope his daughter offered him and pretending to listen to James's chest with great seriousness. "You're right, Lizzie," he said gravely. "Very strong indeed." "Your heart is strong too, Daddy," Elizabeth informed him. "Mama says it's the strongest one of all, because it had to work extra hard to wake up." Yale's eyes met Penelope's over their children's heads. "Your mama's right about that," he said. "My heart was asleep for a very long time, until she came along and woke it up." "With a kiss?" Elizabeth asked, ever the romantic despite her tender age. "Like in the fairy tales?" Yale laughed, pulling both his children into his lap and reaching for Penelope's hand. "Something like that, sweetheart. Something very much like that." Later that night, with the children asleep and the house quiet, Yale and Penelope sat on the porch swing, much as they had done that evening years ago when he had first hinted at a shared future. "Happy?" he asked, his arm around her shoulders. "Immensely," she replied, nestling closer to him. "You?" "More than I ever thought possible." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "Thank you." "For what?" "For seeing something in me worth saving, when everyone else, including me, had given up." Penelope smiled, resting her hand over his heart. "I'm a doctor. Saving lives is what I do." Yale covered her hand with his own, feeling his heart beat strongly beneath their joined hands, no longer the cold mechanical rhythm of mere survival, but the rich, full cadence of a heart fully engaged in the business of living and loving. They said the cowboy had no heart until she made it beat again. And now it beat not just for him, but for her and their children, for their home and their future, together a future brighter than Yale could have imagined in his darkest days. As the stars came out overhead, Yale Preston held his wife close and gave silent thanks for second chances, for healing hands, and for the remarkable woman who had taught him that even the most deeply wounded heart could learn to love again.